Hey everybody, this is Dan Keldsen, Chief Innovation Officer with Infocap.ai. And in this episode of Next Future Today, I was speaking to Chris Surdak, who's the Chief Transformation Officer at IRPA. If you don't know IRPA, that's the Institute for Robotic Process Automation and Artificial Intelligence, which you can find out more about at IRPA.ai. Another cool organization and company that uses .a as their domain. And he's a multi-time author. He's been a research analyst at Gartner. He's been the Chief Transformation Officer at IRPA. He was a mechanical engineer working at NASA. He has quite a lot of experience in a similar sort of parallel path to my own career, but also very different, which is fascinating. We talk about a lot of little details that I think most people would not have normally stumbled upon. We're both very curious gents. And things like governance for AI come up. How do you determine what the value is of information? How do you make sure that you're providing context that makes AI useful? What is it about understanding how automation fails, and why should you focus some time on how to prevent failure in automation versus only focus on let's make automation successful? And there might be some reasons why the stats on IT projects are abysmal generally, regardless of whether it's automation related or not. So we cover a whole bunch of stuff that I think if you're involved in enterprise automation, generative AI, anything that smells like that process, or just generally in sort of making sane decisions about where you should be spending your time, money, and resources as an enterprise. And I think we have a bunch of things that are going to be useful for you in this conversation, and we should just get right to it. Here we go. Mr. Chris, how are you? It's been at least several weeks since we were talking about a webinar that we're going to be doing with our companies. How are you? How's it going?
Several weeks. It was like decades and dog years or something. Doing well. I'm like everyone else, just popping popcorn, waiting for the next headlines to come out every day. It's endless entertainment in a very scary way.
We've come across each other. I'm surprised we didn't come across each other much earlier, because we have a lot of things in common. But through IRPA, IRPA.ai, that's a community of people that are focused on robotic process automation, intelligent automation. There's a whole universe of things that fall into the bucket. For us as Infocap, that's a great community for us because people already understand that automation is a thing that matters, and that there isn't enough of, because they tend to, organizations tend to put huge buckets of automation in some closed system and then never think about how data gets in and out and how people interact with them and things like that. So it is wonderful to talk to people who already understand those problems and solutions and are a bit farther along the path than everybody who has no idea that you can do things with paper that don't involve just sitting there and staring at them and typing them up. So, and you've been involved with IRPA for over 8 years at this point. And I know from looking at your history, you come from mechanical engineering, so I'm hoping to connect the dots here. But what led you directly into IRPA specifically?
Brief prison sentence. No, I started doing my first work in process automation in 1993 as a brand new spacecraft systems engineer at Lockheed Martin. And speaking of paper, at the time, if we wanted to make a change to the spacecraft design, we had to get an engineering change notice. It was a piece of paper, required like 7 signatures. So each of the senior engineers for the spacecraft had to sign off. If you wanted to go from a size 8 screw to a size 10 screw, you needed all 7 signatures. It didn't matter how expensive the change was. And it generally took about 5 weeks to get sign-offs. And again, it didn't matter how impactful the change was. That's how long it took. And my dad at the time was big in IT, an IT executive at Corning. And there was this new thing that came out that he was all excited about called Lotus Notes. And he's like, Chris, you should try Lotus Notes. You can, fix it. And from that moment on, I was hooked on IT and on business process automation. We managed to go from, I think it was like 5 weeks, down to 3 days. In 1993, the internet was all of 3 days old or something. So seeing the power of that really set me on an entirely different course. So, by the time robotic process automation came around, I was in my 3rd episode of Groundhog's Day, the movie. I've seen all this before.
One of my favorite movies. Except when it seems to happen in actual life, then it's not quite so fun. But, as somebody who likes to learn, I like the idea that you can like become a master, by the end of the movie.
Well, and eventually we'll be talking about LLMs and AI, and there's this astonishing disconnect when you take a contextless technology like large language models, and you're missing that whole, you touch the stove, you burn yourself, don't do it again. That's context, and LLMs inherently and mathematically do not have context, so we keep touching the stove and we keep burning ourselves and can't figure out why.
I always mangle the story. It was Einstein, right? About relativity, the pain that you feel from putting your hand on an oven and how that contrasts with talking to a pretty woman. It's the
I don't know this
time.
story, but now I'm gonna have to look it up.
Yeah, I will definitely mangle it, but it's looking through your
Oh,
past.
like
There's
how
certainly.
long the time feels to you? Yeah,
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So it can
Einstein
seem like
Einstein's well
infinitely
ahead of his time.
long, right? In a very short time, actually. And then also extremely short, even though it might have been a long time. So it's just, I've had a history of playing around with words a lot and doing consulting work in taxonomies and ontologies and mapping all sorts of things, enterprise search. So being able to play with words and define things like that, it's a lot of fun for me. Speaking of which, I think that I'm very curious about this. So I think we're aligned on this. I typically say, like there are a lot of futurists that are totally disconnected from reality. They just talk about things that may or may not happen. There's no impact to them if they're wrong, because who can predict what the future is, and it doesn't matter. But they can just keep spouting a bunch of ideas that have absolutely no bearing on reality. And then I'll call that blue sky futurism. It's all optimistic. Nothing bad can ever happen. It's going to be fantastic. Just you wait. And then there's total pessimistic, non-futurists are on the, I'll believe it when I see it, thanks very much. And after several billion people have already tried it and not died. And then I'll go in there. And then somewhere in between there, for me, I call it pragmatic futurism. So I want to be paying attention to what's coming down the pike so I can help interpret for myself and for clients, what is it that you should actually pay attention to out of the bazillion things that you could pay attention to that might actually impact your organization. And I think the way that you described the work that you did at Leading Edge Forum, the work is breakthrough yet pragmatic, which smells vaguely similar or maybe entirely similar. So what's your take on, how does futurism meet pragmatism, and can they actually live together? Is there something we can use to help expose people to how to sort of break that dichotomy?
I don't think that dichotomy is an accident. I think it's actually inherent in the universe and nature. In a lot of this AI stuff, I've gone down the path of actually evolutionary psychology and brain physiology. There's this scientist, Ian McGilchrist, out of Scotland, who's been studying brain injuries. So someone like has a stroke, or like they get, something happens to one of the hemispheres in the brain, and then he's like studying, and what he's found is astonishing. All animals above the size of like a hookworm have bifurcated nervous systems, right brain, left brain. The nematodes have like 66 neurons in their entire nervous system, and it's already bifurcated, which tells me that the universe requires bifurcation in order to truly understand it. That can't be an accident. So I think, and that as scientists, you go, okay, we think that the Earth is going to be swallowed by the sun 5 billion years from now. Really interesting, not terribly pragmatic to me right now. There's this understanding of, is this prediction that you're making interesting? Yeah. Is it usable? Is it pragmatic? Is there some value from applying it? And can I change my more near-term results, something less than 5 billion year timeframes, to have better results? And I think the other thing, as an engineer and scientist, I guess you could say, that I've uncovered in the time that I've been, paying attention, is that nature repeats itself. It is a pattern machine, except for when it's not. And that takes you back to like ideas of fractals. Fractals repeat themselves constantly, but it's never the same twice, kind of thing. And I find more and more that that's true of the universe as well, is that you can expect to see patterns over and over again. And when you don't see a pattern over and over again, that's when you're learning something significant.
That's funny. So I was going to bring up fractals a couple minutes ago because I had a feeling that that's another shared interest that we have about the what are the wolves that they just
Oh, the dire wolves that they
the dire wolves.
sort of
So
came back from
yeah.
extinction.
So Jeff Goldblum's character in Jurassic Park talks about nature will find a way, and chaos, right? And chaos was a whole thing. Chaos theory was a whole big thing in the late 80s, early 90s, which
It
is
was huge and it
what.
died. I remember like
Yeah, I know.
reading 20 books on it, and like it never came up again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to, the level of math that I have is not sufficient to really understand it, but just the concepts in it, I think, are a lot of fun to play with. There's a lot of, I saw that you have some background in cybersecurity. You have a law degree. Understanding risk, and you can't protect against everything. It's completely impossible, right? So how do you do enough to give you options so that a risk happens and you have a chance to react to it? That's one thing that you should put in place. That's one of the concerns that I know that I have, and I believe that you have around AI, is that people just assume, hey, I'll just throw, ChatGPT is the one everybody brings up. I'll just throw that at whatever my problem is. Like for us, since we live in the RPA world and IDP, well, Gen AI can just automatically figure out what your piece of paper says. Well, that's awesome. But what should it be allowed to say? And what decisions are made based on that, and how much is enough information, and how many fields don't even matter anymore. There's it's not magic. And even if it was magic, it's not enough magic to fully understand this context of what you're trying to do. So I've been thinking lately, for some reason, I don't really know why, but about the whole chaos theory stuff, because we tend to go way off the rails sometime, and then all of our common sense just flies out the window. And we don't do real decision making, especially for enterprise stuff.
Yeah, decision making is a collective delusion that we put together to explain things after the fact, usually. Not that I feel strongly about it one way or the other. But, everyone's hallucinations in AI. Oh my gosh, where's this coming from? Dude, it's chaos. I guarantee if anybody if I find I gave myself some homework, I'm going to dig up all those old chaos books, and I promise you in there, that's partially the explanation for hallucinations from AI. It's just the aggregation and multiplication of cumulative errors and instabilities in systems. So over time, those errors will inevitably lead to some sort of catastrophic failure. And the longer you delay the failure, the worse the failure is likely to be. I was ruined as a spacecraft engineer. I was assigned to be the guy, there'd be 50 guys trying to get us to Mars, and they'd all be designing away. And I was the guy that had to make sure we didn't blow up along the way. I was the reliability, the resilience engineer. And so they would be coming up with designs, and I'd be the one that said, okay, here's the 32 ways it could fail, which made me not terribly popular with the other engineers until something went wrong. And then I was the most popular guy in the room. So that really colored my approach to science and engineering and design and so forth for kind of the rest of my career. So that's, a lot of people say, well, you're such a naysayer. I'm like, no, I'm just pragmatic, to your earlier point. Failure is inherent in every system, so plan for it.
Right. And recognize that you can't anticipate and prevent everything. It's literally impossible.
And the best you can do is build in enough margin of error so that you can then respond when it happens. Because if you have an error, a failure of some kind that was anticipatable, then you failed, right? You were incompetent. As an engineer, you're supposed to figure out all the knowable, what is that, type 1 problems, the known knowns. And so I spent my entire career living in the unknown unknowns and unknown known. No, there aren't any unknown. You know what I'm getting at.
Yeah, it gets a little fuzzy there.
Yeah. Well, and then so fuzz is good if someone's covering for it.
Right. So I was wondering whether to bring this up or not, but I have a suspicion. You know about OODA loops? So for people that don't know what the heck that is, you want to take a stab at explaining
No,
it?
go ahead. I mean,
Okay.
it was the observe, orient,
decide, act.
decide, and act.
Yeah.
Hopefully in that order.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And the point of it, so that's Colonel John Boyd, who was in the Air Force. I think it was 10-second John Boyd. So he could go through this loop, flying at supersonic speeds in jets in warfare. And his point was, the faster that you can go through this loop, the more, essentially in warfare, the less likely you are the one to be blown to bits in the sky. Right. So the faster you can make these decisions, you need fast reflexes. You need to be able to, so observe something, orient to what does that actually mean, decide what you're going to do about it, and then actually act. And if you spend too much time in any one of those pieces of the cycle, then anybody else that's beating you in that, if they consistently do that, you're just doomed, right? Because it's just a matter of time before you run out of time.
But this is back to my resilience thing. Unless you do one of the 4 things incorrectly. If you make a misdecision, miscalculation, misobservation in any of the 4, then the faster you do it, the more likely it is, and the faster you will fail. So this leads to, and I've written on this extensively, if you sense in business for the better part of 20 years, this massive inertia to not do anything, right? Don't make decisions, right? We're going to put together, oh, we need to do something. We're going to put together a tiger team and have weekly status meetings. And then we're going to do an offsite in Orlando. And then we'll get back to you in 7 years.
Yeah.
Right.
I was going to say 6
Sometime
months,
after
but
I'm
yes.
ready to retire. I think that's actually systemic to the capitalist society we're in. One of the things I discuss in one of my books is capital has no value in motion. Information has no value at rest. And that'll probably resonate with you as a data guy. From being in the law, there's a rule called the mailbox rule. If I owe you $100 and I send you a check for $100 and I put the check in the mail, who has $100? Do I? Kind of, but I wrote the check, so sort of I've already spent it. Do you have it? No, you haven't received it yet. So in the law, we actually came up with a rule that says, well, if you've mailed it, then it's no longer yours and it kind of falls to the recipient. But while capital's in motion, it has no value. I can't put it in my books. Information is the exact opposite. And because capital has no value in motion, people hate to make decisions that involve capital. So it's very natural. The problem is digital transformation, where we're moving from a capital-oriented world for the last 250 years to an information-centered world where information is the source of wealth. I have to completely change how I do everything, because the just sit and wait and hope nothing happens approach that was successful for a quarter of a millennia is exactly the wrong thing to do now.
Sitting there faster doesn't equal better
Strangely well,
outcomes.
and if you always have a positive interest rates, then doing nothing always leads to some kind of positive return. Prior to 2008 and the crash of 2008, no one believed that there was such a thing as negative interest rates. If you went into your ERP system and tried to enter a negative interest rate in one of the fields, it would reject your attempt to put in a negative interest rate. We had to rewrite millions of lines of code all over the world in 2009 because we had to be able to put in negative interest rates.
Do you mention that in Jerk?
I think I might have. Yeah.
I scanned through the Kindle copy of Jerk last night, and just a whole bunch of things popped out of that. And I think negative interest was one of those, and it is.
That was a shot across the bow for people, because that's literally anti-capitalism.
This is awesome. It feels like we're sort of plugged into the same hive mind or something. I'm entirely sure what's going on, except that I'm corrupted by your Jerk book. So one of the questions I was going to ask you, which ties nicely into this, is the fellow from Gartner that provided the opening lines for
Doug
Jerk.
Laney, the inventor of the term big data.
Part of his blurb is, he had mistakenly believed information was a recognized asset. This fueled my desire to further develop and advocate the concept of infonomics. And even though information was denied asset class status, it was imperative that organizations measured, managed, and monetized it as if it were an actual asset. Straight to what we were just talking about, one of my questions is, I never meant to be involved in this industry at all. They're total accidental that 31 years ago this month, I happened to fall into a consulting company that did workflow, process, information management stuff, right? And I didn't know what that was. I was the guy that made sure that the computers kept running, and I did. I was the first IT support guy there. And it feels kind of amazing to me that somebody who really had no business knowing about the economics of information and why should you care to protect it? I've done cybersecurity stuff, as my primary role. We have to protect the brand, the digital assets, the physical assets, the machinery that, that makes it all run, all that kind of stuff. But if you don't recognize that there is value in paperwork, broadly, whether it's digital or not, whatever your data is, then how can you make a decision on what should you do to improve it? Because you have no baseline. It's we know that we're terrible at this and it takes us forever to process a claim or whatever it happens to be, but what's the value of that? If you don't have that value tied to it, it makes it hard to have a financial discussion about should we do that or not.
If you ignore it, then it kind of goes away until it doesn't go away. And then it comes back and bites you hard. I think the example I had in my book, Jerk, was Radio Shack. Radio Shack, when you and I were kids, you'd go there all the time. You get your little electronics and your little remote control cars and all that kind of stuff, Nintendo, Game Boy, and whatnot. And then almost 15 years ago now, they went bankrupt because, no one was doing that anymore. You just go to Amazon. But what was interesting, when they broke up the bankrupt entity of Radio Shack and they were selling off the assets of the company, nobody cared about the storefronts. Nobody cared about inventory. Nobody wanted any of that stuff. What everybody was fighting over was their information. And one of the funny things about Radio Shack, when the Commodore 64 first came out in the mid 1980s, every Radio Shack had a Commodore 64 in the store. And before they would ring you up, and you probably remember this is totally annoying, they'd ask you for every bit of personal information that you'd be willing to give up then. your name, your address, your phone number, pedestrian stuff today. But back then that was game changing. And so that's the only thing creditors cared about in ripping apart of what was left of Radio Shack when it went bankrupt. So it's one of those things, if you don't get it, you don't get it. But if you don't get it, you're probably not going to be around much longer. I think we're at, was it over 55% of the Fortune 500 that were on the list 10 years ago are now gone. They're not on the list now. So, that's fairly Darwinian as far as I'm concerned.
So I left the sort of the world of doing consulting and analyst research and whatnot for workflow and information management and all that stuff, because at some point I got tired of trying to sell people on things that they didn't even realize they should care. So,
yeah, I feel your pain.
So it's like, but you could do so much more if you did this thing that, money's not real anyhow. It's
the greatest collective delusion humanity has ever developed was fiat currency.
There you go.
Stunning achievement.
Beyond that was crypto, but that's a different discussion.
That's the digitized version of the collective delusion.
There you go. It's better, faster, cheaper, even less predictable.
Well, and even more in motion, which is the key, right?
Yeah, there you go.
The whole point of having the distributed processing is that it's effectively always in motion, which is what information wants to be.
Yeah, information wants to be free. So I hinted at it. We talked slightly about, so you have a book called Jerk. I have to see it. When I saw that was the name, I instantly bought it because The Jerk by Steve Martin is, yeah, exactly. Congratulations for the 30-cent check you'll be getting in about 6 months. The Jerk featuring Steve Martin is one of my favorite comedy movies of all time. I was a little disappointed that there appears to be no reference to Steve Martin or the movie The Jerk in your book.
Well, which, as you bring up, is a missed opportunity. The whole thing of, the snipers hitting the cans and he's saying the cans are defective. That pretty much describes most executives in a nutshell right there from my experience. If you're not properly analyzing your data, you think the cans are defective when they're blowing up.
Yeah, that's like the classic moment in that movie. What is Jerk about? I keep wanting to say The Jerk. But what is Jerk, the book, about?
That was actually my second book. First Data Crush came out a couple years prior. So this was my sophomore effort. And in that time frame, 2013, 2014 is when Uber was coming out, Airbnb was just coming out, these really disruptive companies that made no sense to anybody. Everybody's like, how in the world can a couple of people living in a shipping container deploy a company that does something effectively illegal, like breaks the law in nearly every jurisdiction they're operating in, and it gets other people to use their capital assets for your benefit? How does that even happen? And people's minds were blown at that time. And so I studied this pretty extensively for about a year, and then came up with basically the formula. There's a 12-step formula for being a jerk, being a disrupt. And like you, I love playing with words. Jerk is actually from my spacecraft days, because the third derivative of the equation of motion. So you have velocity, acceleration, then jerk. And when we were trying to calculate how do we keep a rocket from blowing up on launch, you had to calculate jerk to make sure. So if you're in an elevator and it bounces that little bit and you get like that queasy feeling, that's jerk. So it was just a multi-purpose word. People were thinking back then, and even more now, Elon Musk is a jerk. He's disruptive. The multifaceted use of the word is kind of what led to that. And the book was the 12-step recipe for being a digital disruptor, for taking advantage of this shift away from capital-centered wealth, which is where we've been for 250 years, to information-centered wealth, and what it takes to make that transition happen.
Yeah. So, and I think that came out in 2014. So, okay. So
I'm sorry, 2015. So 10 years. Yeah.
Interesting. So, book that I co-wrote, The Gen Z Effect, also 2014, similar time frame, not quite the same topics, which is fun because it's so tiring to everybody refers to the same companies and case studies and people. It's like, why write another book if everybody else has already written about how wonderful Steve Jobs is? So in the Gen Z Effect, I coined a term called slingshotting, which I think relates. So like jerks take advantage of slingshotting. So slingshotting is, the crossing the chasm model or diffusions of innovation or any of those kinds of things. So I like to live on the front edge of, early adopter, early innovator, be a part of making things happen and then see where it goes because I'm up to that kind of thing. But, a lot of people are not. And it used to really frustrate me because they're like, look, there's such potential here. Just like how do you value your information? If you don't, then clearly you're not going to do anything. So slingshotting is essentially my realization that if you wait, that whole massive adoption of Main Street and laggards, by the time it gets the back end of the curve, then people who have not bothered can slingshot from the past where they're probably 20 years behind what technology could do or whatever the current business model might be, and suddenly they're there. So they bypass, so they stayed out, and then they shoot straight over all the stuff that kind of sucked and was painful. It was expensive, didn't quite work. I usually describe it as I would get shot in the front and in the back at the same time because nothing was certain, and I was there trying to navigate the minefield. So it sounds vaguely like it's a flavor of I think of what you were getting at with Jerk. That it's there was a stability in expectations for business for a fairly long amount of time, and then suddenly it shifted dramatically and jerked.
In Jerk, I have a chapter that talks about, there's a whole section on if you're an existing player, how do you kind of fight off jerks? How do you fight off the innovators? The DEI process, discover, infiltrate, exploit. And so as you kind of saying in Sling, the discover phase is really painful. Lots of people die, it's expensive. You're going to get things wrong, etc. But eventually you get a foothold, and you can think of this like explorers or Cortez landing in the new world. Like you discover, hey, there's a new world out here. Then you infiltrate it, kind of move in and take over and start extracting value. And then once you kind of really know the lay of the land, then you exploit it, which is kind of a negative sounding word, but that's basically what you're doing. Here's a resource, we're going to exploit it. So I think it parallels with what you're saying. The slingshotting is you wait for the exploit phase. And if you have a bigger fleet than the next, the British exploited what the Spanish discovered and infiltrated. So I think, again, history keeps repeating itself, and it's just faster now, but it's the same process.
I wish I'd stumbled onto Jerk before last night, because then I could have read more. But yeah, it is funny because looking at like our timelines and the kinds of things that we've done, we have had very similar lives. It is kind of wild.
Two Schrodinger's cats in two different boxes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was going to say, so when you were talking about capital, the mailbox rule, was it called? So it's Schrodinger's payment at that point.
Spot on, right? And we started talking about Einstein, and Einstein, even though he came up with quantum mechanics, he hated uncertainty. And it's interesting, we've made almost no progress in physics since Niels Bohr and my favorite, Dirac. Dirac was probably the greatest genius ever, and we know nothing about it. So I'm convinced that he actually proved that calculus is an illusion, but no one wants to have that conversation. But, again, so that uncertainty factor is probably the most important thing for us to protect against, if not look for, because it's always there.
Yeah, you can conveniently ignore it, but it's still there.
Well, people at 3 Mile Island learn the hard way. You can ignore it until it rears its ugly head, and then the longer we delay recognition of the problem, the worse the problem's going to be.
We could play around with this a lot, I think. Is there a destructive jerk moment? So like this looming problem kept getting pushed out, and then suddenly it snapped back and whacked you right in the face.
Almost always. And in fact, we always do that, right? We always look for the explanation after the fact. So 9/11, oh my gosh, there was all these signals beforehand, and Fukushima, the space shuttle disasters, all of them, we could have and should have known beforehand. Well, yeah, but again, if it was really knowable beforehand, then we were incompetent, or it just was a failure mode it never occurred to us to look at. And you live and learn, hopefully. Problem is now the lessons are coming so fast, particularly in the world of AI now, and the target is moving so quickly that you rapidly lose a sense of who actually knows what they're talking about and who doesn't, and what is signal and what is noise. And we have to remember that the noise in answering one question is the signal in answering another. That's why I always hated ETL, extract, transform, whatever processes in data, because you'd say, well, this is garbage data over here. Well, yeah, for the questions that you already think you want to ask, but they're literally the answers to 17 other questions that you never thought to ask, and as soon as you strip them away, they're not askable anymore.
Yeah, or you just quadruple your cost because you put that somewhere else, then don't bother to use it. So we definitely have some commonality, so OODA loops, things that smell like knowledge management and risk management and all those kinds of things. In your LinkedIn profile, you have the image of the famous mapping of all the damage done to airplanes, and to the point of looking at the data, like you can't see the data that's in those planes that got blown up and understand what happened there. You can extrapolate from reality of people who saw what happened, but it's interesting that there's a whole realm of biases which I don't have memorized at all. There are these things that, despite us thinking we're rational people, we're making strategic investments as a CEO or CIO or something. There's all this stuff that we have not even considered. So data that we're not looking at it. There might be we have to, because our peers are upgrading their ERP, we should too, or else we're going to be behind. Well, maybe not. Maybe there's some other bigger opportunity that you're missing, but you're not even looking at the data on the disruptive moments of Uber and Airbnb and those kinds of things. So you're hyper focusing on this legacy way of thinking and not seeing all this other data that shows that, hey, maybe it's time to, I don't know, fire up a spinoff or something that is an experiment that doesn't like put all our eggs in one basket. Are you seeing any common threads? Because you've been involved in automation process stuff for a long time. Are there certain biases that keep people from that either they're like, oh my God, I finally see this thing and now I'm going to do real automation for the first time, or they're just like, I don't see it. Doesn't matter what you're showing me. Like they're not capable. Is there some sort of common mindset that can flip people from to either not caring or to suddenly caring a great deal?
Yeah, failure. It's the old touching the stove as a little kid thing, and which is in my book. We're hardwired to avoid pain more than we chase after pleasure to a certain extent, which is just a survival thing. And it's back to that right brain, left brain. Hey, I'm really hungry. Yeah, but that apple tree, there's a line between me and the apple tree, so let's not go there. And so when you combine that with this capitalist notion of do nothing, I can make 3% by doing nothing. There's deep rewards to talk about transformation, but not actually do it, right? So this gets lip service. Like, I mean, the number of PowerPoints that have been created through, the history of Microsoft saying we're going to do something innovative and cool and all that other kind of and transformational, and literally nothing happened is astronomical. And oh, by the way, this is the data that we're now training LLMs on. So we wonder why they hallucinate. Well, garbage in, garbage out. If you're teaching it all of our hallucinations, guess what? It's going to hallucinate too. But my third book came from 3 years of really implementing at enterprise scale robotic process automation, and the stuff just didn't work. Or the failures that would occur would be along the lines of our conversation. When they failed, they would fail catastrophically. And in the post-mortem, you can say, oh, well, we should have seen that. Well, if you saw it ahead of time, you shouldn't have done it in the first place. So for me, that 3 years of rolling out RPA was, again, the movie Groundhog's Day. I'm like, I've been through this movie before. This is, why did that spacecraft blow up stuff from 20 years prior? And we're seeing the exact same thing in AI, right? It's like, well, we fired half of our workforce and replaced it with ChatGPT, and now ChatGPT doesn't work. So I think, dumping $1 trillion into a vast guessing machine that we call LLMs, which is all they are, we're going to keep throwing more money into that pot until we realize it simply doesn't work. And since some people have had some significant failures from that. And then, there's a couple of percentage of people that will actually listen to doing things differently. Whether you follow Gartner, Forrester, or any of the analyst firms, which I worked for briefly as well, they find consistently that only about 5% of IT projects in the history of IT are ever successful. Basically, the 5% of the people that actually kind of, I think, ascribe to my philosophy here, which is everybody can try to do it right. Who's going to try to prevent from doing it wrong? And that's the 5% that succeed. It's the who built in some resilience, who saw that they were on the path of failure and pivoted, who had the Apollo 13 moment, something just blew up and now we got to fly home. Do we have enough flexibility in the spacecraft to get back? If someone didn't figure out how to make that, put the two cartridges together in Apollo 13, it wouldn't be it'd be a different kind of hero story. We'll just say that. We don't celebrate the 10,000 non-Steve Jobs that didn't succeed. We celebrate Steve who did. And he always talked about fail fast and then learn from it.
The point of Next Future Today is kind of ties to the saying, the best time to plant a tree was 20 or 80 years ago, depending on your timeline, or today. So came out of a month into the COVID lockdown. I thought, I know a lot of smart people around the world who own businesses or CEOs of large companies, whatever, and they had goals and plans January 1 that probably don't look quite the same here in April 2020, and to the point of the whole OODA loop. And I was like, well, it's one thing to say oops or there's something, we need to do something. And the question is, how fast do we decide what we're going to do based on what we think the impact might be? So what I'm trying to do with Next Future Today is to give people a sense as to, let's stop talking about the future like it's, the far off future. What can we do to help you get started today to do something that might help you understand what's actually possible with generative AI or RPA or things like that. So if people have not really gone down the path yet at all, what would you recommend they consider doing right now today so that they can decide purposely if RPA or LLMs or generative AI or any of the kinds of things that we both live in are a path that they should consider taking?
The challenge is, if you haven't taken the steps yet, if you're waiting for the slingshot, I would say look at the people who are most emphatically jumping on as rapidly really quickly and loudly and boisterously as they possibly can, and understand that it's almost guaranteed that they're in the 95% that are going to fail at this. There's the kind of the old joke, these explorers are cutting their way through the jungle and someone stops and says, "Hey, everybody stop, we're heading in the wrong direction." And they yell back, "Shut up, we're making progress." And the world of generative AI is a whole lot of shut up, we're making progress right now, not realizing we have no idea which direction we're heading in. I think part of it is we have a tendency to surround ourselves with the voices that most strongly reinforce our own biases. You used that term before. And so as much as it discomforts me, and discomfort is the key that you're doing this right, look for the naysayers, look for the counter voices, look for the if everyone's saying generative AI is going to change the world, look at the people that are saying this is garbage and it's not going to work, and at least pay some credence to their voice, right? If you're a hard right, neo-Nazi, you should be listening to, what the communists say or whoever you think your opposite is. At least be aware of the polar opposite, because at a minimum, it's going to draw you more towards the middle, and the universe kind of likes sticking in the middle for the most part. If we have a catastrophic failure, it means that probably we swung the pendulum too far the other way, and the catastrophic failure is the corrective action. Hey, you missed this. So in as much as I'm a big believer in data and information, seek out the counter messaging, and particularly where we are in the life cycle of generative AI. We have to realize that this is, from a consumptive perspective, it's really only been around for 3 years. 2022 is really when it came out. 2022 was the birth. 2023 was the hype. 2024 was when people started making commitments. 2025 is when they have to start delivering on the commitments. 2026 is when they start explaining why they failed. So if you haven't jumped in yet, hold back, look at the people that are kind of are naysayers now, and just understand and absorb sort of that counter voice that's kind of against the mainstream. Mark Twain, I actually grew up where he lived, Elmira, New York. And one of my favorite sayings of his is that if you ever find yourself in the majority, you must pause and reflect. The idea being that you're probably wrong, particularly with generative AI right now. That's very much kind of my thought and my word of caution to people. If you haven't drunken the Kool-Aid fully yet, step back, start looking for some anti-Kool-Aid, and then see which looks like it's more correct, because the answer is probably going to be somewhere in between the two.
I like that. And I think that's personally, purposely look to find sort of outliers, not just because I like Malcolm Gladwell, but, kind of widening the radar. It drives me slightly insane because I have a pretty wide radar sweep, but it also gives me a chance to see something that's like, ooh, nobody's talking about this thing over here, but that seems important. And I should, now I zoomed in over here and there's a whole bunch of people saying, hey, by the way, the current controversy, I don't know if it's a controversy, all the protocols around how you connect agents and, do agentic AI and all that kind of stuff. Like, ours is better. Well, and there's people like, I still use SOAP. It's from 20 years ago. It's, okay. The wonderful thing about standards is there's so many to choose from.
That's the ERP. We're going to adopt ERP, so we have world-class processes, just like everyone else. Oh, you're eliminating your differentiation from everyone? Congratulations.
So you got a bunch of books. You have a book coming out when this year?
Should be in the next couple of months. The AI Governance Playbook, attempted giving people a comprehensive framework. Here's everything you need to think about if you're crazy enough to go down this AI route. What I love about writing a book about AI governance is AI is effectively ungovernable, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
We're going to have to circle back on that one and see what the reaction is. But as somebody who, I can't say that I love governance, but I've come to appreciate it, especially guardrails, and I'm fascinated. Guardrails are finally mentioned. I used to feel like I was the only person talking about guardrails like 15 years ago. And suddenly that's a thing that comes up a lot more often in AI. But we'll save that for a different day. So for people that want to get in touch with you through LinkedIn,
LinkedIn's probably best, or through IRPA, the professional association I tie off with. And we have 130,000 members. It's actually a very active community, and there's a whole bunch of people that are trying to struggle through these problems for the benefit of all. So
great. Well, thanks to you so much for your time today, Chris. I had a feeling it was going to be an interesting ride, and I'm glad that you went along with me for that ride. And I hope we have another couple interesting rides coming up in the years to come. There's plenty that we can certainly talk about and dissect at a level that I think most people aren't going to go to. So hopefully this is adding some value to the world.
Yeah, I look forward to it. We'll do it again.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris.
Here.